everyone. I'm Vesper Moore. I am so excited to be here with you all. And this panel on cross-movement solidarity is really timely, I would say. And when we think about civil rights movements, and we think about civil rights movements in the context of psychosis and mental health and disability, as we've been discussing, there's so much interconnection with other movements. And here we have some brilliant, I think wonderful leaders in the disability justice and mad liberation space that I want to welcome. So first, I'm going to actually start with Nadia. And I'm going to actually ask folks if they would like to introduce themselves for a moment before we start our questions. So Nadia, if you'd like to introduce yourself, name, pronouns, a little bit about yourself.
Hi everyone, my name is Nadia Naomi Mbande. I use she, they pronouns, and I'm a mad, queer, Black person that has navigated various altered states and psychosis. I live with a bipolar diagnosis, and that has greatly impacted my experience, particularly with motherhood and parenting. So my cross-movement work is really at the intersection of reproduction and mental health. And I am an artist, I'm a scholar, I'm a PhD student at NYU in the Department of Anthropology. I'm a mental health doula. I wear a lot of hats, and I'd be happy to get more into it in our conversation.
Excellent. Welcome, Nadia. And we will go over to Dustin. Welcome, Dustin.
Hey, what's up? This is Dustin. I use he and him pronouns. I currently live in Baltimore, Maryland. I come out of the independent living movement. That's my introduction into movement work. I worked on the ground providing like support services for disabled people through a Center for Independent Living where we're led by, governed by, and we're servicing disabled folks at every level. Inside of that work, I guess the focus was youth self-determination. So I work with a lot of young folks that are disabled and just like becoming. So everything that entails, along with nursing facility transitioning. Then that work kind of like led into prison abolitionist work. Well, really prison reform work first, and then prison abolitionist work. And since then, I've really like worked within peer support spaces to support other people that have come home from institutions or attempting to come home from institutions. And myself, I'm a survivor of institutions, medical incarceration. And yeah, I'll just pause there and pass it to Steph. I'm sure we'll get into like more stuff later.
Thank you, Dustin. And we're going to go over to Stephanie. Hey, Stephanie.
Hello, everyone. My name is Stephanie. I use they and she pronouns. What to say? I am a multiply disabled psychiatric survivor. I'm white. I come from a multi-ethnic family of Ashkenazi Jewish and Boricua descent, and have been situated within peer support spaces and movement for roughly over a decade now, which gradually through my own experiences with more physical disability drew connections and bridges with disability justice spaces, and have been situated in that kind of middle world between mad liberation and disability justice, which have a lot of very critical and core intersections, and yet ways that there are points of separation that become barriers for our work. So I've been situated there as well. And also just a legacy and lineage of mad healers and people who have not necessarily viewed their experiences through a medical lens, and have lost access to language or knowledge or frameworks due to colonial violence and white supremacist Eurocentric indoctrination of certain ways of understanding ourselves. So in terms of cross-movement work, I also draw a lot of connections between the impacts of colonialism and whiteness on our mental health, on disability. And yeah, I'm sure we will continue chatting about that today as well.
Thank you, Stephanie. I will go to Leah. I know folks know you, Leah, but would you like to just do a quick intro?
Of course, I did a quick introduction earlier, but I'll repeat myself because people might not have been here earlier and folks online may just be joining us now. So I'm Leah Giorgini and I'm Executive Director of ISPS-US. As I disclosed earlier, I'm also a survivor of the psychiatric system. I've also lived through domestic violence as a child, sexual assault. I've been in the foster care system. I've been homeless with my mother when I was a kid. So lots of stuff in my background I bring forward today into my work. And I think the first time I became aware of and started thinking kind of intersectionally, even before that was a term, was when my therapist, when I was 17 years old, gave me a book on feminism and self-harm. And it just opened my eyes up to, hey, this isn't a problem with me, this is a problem with society. So I'm really excited to be here today and share space with these amazing thought leaders.
It's great to have you here, Leah. And then, as I said earlier, I'm Vesper Moore. I'm a mad liberation activist and a disability activist. And I think something that's so important in this space when we say mad liberation, I know some of our panelists had mentioned it, we're talking about mad as a way of subverting and defying our traditional understanding of mental health and as a social identity that people are reclaiming, that we reclaim. And I think that that's so important when we talk about social justice movements. In the same way queer has been reclaimed and a lot of other terms have been reclaimed. It's a way of taking our power back. So just to start up, we're going to start with the first question, and I'm going to actually start with Dustin and then kind of move through the panelists here. Can you please describe your advocacy or movement lineage and how the values and principles from your background have shaped your approaches and viewpoints? And we'll start with Dustin.
Yeah, this is Dustin. Yeah, I think, my experience, has been shaped by colonialism. It's been shaped by anti-Blackness. It's been shaped by, systems that have literally changed people and changed the land, like slavery. It's been shaped by Jim Crow. Like, and I say that because like my introduction to, what it is to be mad, what it is to be disabled is like just being a person and living and experiencing and experiences like shared within my family. So I think I came to it like a lot of people do, at least like how I reconciled it or how I've intellectualized like disability. And just like thinking people are crazy, right? And thinking that is something that is like from within for the most part, and that it has no connections with what we've experienced or we're currently experiencing. And I think, for a movement lineage, like I said, like I mentioned, I come out of like independent living traditions, which is like firmly set in the Black radical tradition, whether it's like credited that way or not. The disability movements that we know of in the US come out of the Black radical tradition. So with that, like the cornerstone to that movement, the IL movement, has always been freedom. Freedom of disabled folks from, at that time, warehousing people in what we would call traditional institutions that have water towers that are self-sustaining. Now, where I'm at, like currently, located on the time spectrum, it's like these institutions exist like within community. And then they have also expanded into prisons and whatnot, not to make some direct correlation between deinstitutionalization and like the rise of incarceration, because both of those are, yeah, I think it's more complex than just that. But how it shaped it is like, I mean, I came in as like a person that's like disabled and like thinking like, yo, I need to like fix this like within me. And that's like what all of my therapy, that's what all of my psych institutions, whether voluntary or forced, look like when I was a teenager. And that has like shaped how we move through the work now. Um, I think another thing that has been important, which I've like learned on the way and like through study and practice, really is like, what does it look like to have solidarity? That's always existed in the movements. Even like some of the, I think like some of the, what would be like the key milestones, quote unquote, like, or advancements in disability movements, whether they be public access or accommodation to transportation or employment or school or the right to live in community. All of those advancements come through like solidarity. So like as like we're here now, like I'm just like thinking about what does it mean for the Black radical tradition to always be in solidarity with oppressed people globally. Specifically right now, Palestine is experiencing genocide. The Palestinian people are being murdered, being displaced in real time, like streaming from our fucking phones, right? And I think I don't necessarily have an answer to, you know, like how that shapes the advocacy. I know it's something that like concerns us. I know that the US and its connections to Israel, its support of Israel, its allowing, enabling of Israel to commit genocide against the Palestinian people is directly connected to the genocide that happened here to the Piscataway people where I'm currently situated. It's the same colonial powers that trafficked in Africans and forced them to do labor on this very land right here in Baltimore. So I think about like, yes, there's an intergenerational impact to that, right? But then there's also like the residue of that. It like means something that the tactics being used on Palestinians right now are the same tactics that's been used on me in the street, right? When we're saying like, yo, we don't want you to kill us because we're disabled and because we're Black and because we're existing and because we're on privatized land. So to answer the question about movement lineage, like it comes out of the Black radical tradition, at least where I'm situated, which I would believe all disability social movements do, at least in the US. And it is something that is internationalist. And if it's not, then it's stretching to be internationalist because our, you know, struggles are very connected.
Thank you, Dustin, for calling in, I think, multi-level carceral systems and what they look like in our society. I'm going to go to Stephanie next.
Thank you, Dustin. Yeah, I'm having a hard time because it's hard to continue to say words while we are bearing witness to what we are bearing witness to. And feel, I think, a part of being a person who experiences altered states, for me, I experience that as a very deep connection with my ancestors. And I have not always experienced it that way. I was indoctrinated in a culture that taught me that that was the worst thing about myself, right? And it took a very, very long time to get to a point of being able to like move through the world in my own skin and not want to die every day because of the voices that I hear in my head. And the reason that I can be here today and speak to folks and not be drowned out by that battle in my brain is because specifically of Indigenous healers, of Black healers, of people who, despite all of the varied attempts and modalities to destroy people, knowledge, traditions, culture, systems, have maintained and held onto knowledge that is the healing knowledge, because everything that we consider to be something that is healing or good about the mental health system or about what actually helps us in the world comes from Indigenous people. It comes from Indigenous knowledge. And that is very, very important to understand, because that is a way as well in which peer support has been co-opted. And we have to be very clear about, that's why it's hard for me to even talk about what lineages I've been part of, because there's a part of me that is proud to say that I come from the peer support movement, but not the current manifestations of it. But what makes me proud is thinking about back in 1972, Madness Network News having one of their papers, I think it was volume 8, issue 1, on the cover was liberation struggles, abolish prisons, abolish psychiatry, 1972, South Africa, Palestine, named on the cover of this paper. A quote, El pueblo unido jamás será vencido, which is a Chilean protest song. And so all the way back in 1972, folks who were part of the psych survivor movement, who were birthing the peer support movement, were unequivocally in solidarity with the Black liberation movement in the so-called US and a global liberation movement that has been almost entirely wiped from the consciousness of folks who walk in the footsteps of what we call the peer support movement, which for me is an absolute shame, because Dustin is right. And there was another piece in that paper titled State Violence, saying like, why aren't we all out in the streets, making connections between the way that the US government annihilated the Black liberation movement here and what we're doing abroad and what we're doing to our own people. And as somebody who has ancestors in what is colonially known as Puerto Rico, seeing a sign that says the same bombs that were tested in Vieques are the bombs that are being dropped in Palestine, and feeling in my body the pain and the weeping of my ancestors who had to navigate, and also who were assimilated and indoctrinated and coerced and chose whiteness in a lot of different ways. And so thinking about all of these different connections, and for me, my kind of main point here is that when we look at a lineage or we look at a movement, it's important to look at what point in time that we're situating ourselves within that movement, because language shifts and pain and trauma gets weaponized and co-opted, and systems take us, our most radical leaders, and give us jobs within the system to destabilize the very radical work that is happening in our communities. And it leaves us in places where we are associated with things that we don't quite understand the history of. So for me, I just wanted to name that. And also, that I want to just lastly name that I came into this space as somebody who found a lot of refuge and relief in medical language and frameworks. And then I quickly realized that the benefits were very few and the consequences were great. And something that I believe very strongly in these spaces is that why our movements failed was because we were forcing people to choose one lane and one way only, and thinking about situating myself in the values of multiplicity, and allowing ourselves to show up fully with the depth of our experiences that can like lead a multi-ideological movement, whether we say we're mentally ill or we're mad or we're psych survivors or we just have like survived like decades of oppression, that like we have liberation as the central goal for us. So that's kind of where I'm situated.
Thank you for calling that into the space. I think it is important when we look at these movements and we think about peer support and we think about leaders being hired into these roles. We think about the role of capitalism, things that are naturally occurring in our society that get brought into a market, right? So that's what happens to peer support. That's what happens to fights for liberation. That's what happens to a lot of things. And I think it is important to name that. So thank you. And we'll go to Nadia next.
Thank you, Dustin and Stephanie. Just to add, because I resonate with everything that you've both said, My lineage, if I had to kind of condense it, I would say is coming from a Black feminist lineage, which is actually at the root of a lot of our liberation struggles, but it's often unnamed and often unrecognized, unacknowledged. This notion that the personal is political, particularly in our peer work, does come from a Black feminist lens. Intersectionality and looking at cross movement work comes from a Black feminist lens. And the reason why I find this lineage so grounding is because at the root of it is the belief that destroying the systems of oppression that impact me as a Black person will fundamentally liberate all of us. And when I say Black, I also mean that expansively as, yes, people of African descent, but globally, those in who are Black, who are oppressed, who are at the bottom of this hierarchy of white supremacy. So it's really beautiful to see even now the ways in which we're all as Black people rallying and understanding so at our core what is going on in Palestine and how it is just inextricably linked to our own personal struggles for liberation. And that does come also from a Black feminist lens. And one thing I'd like to just bring into the space, which I find I'm often bringing in, is reproductive justice in conversation with Mad Liberation. And so a definition for reproductive justice that I'd like to call in, which is from Sister Song, which was the first woman of color reproductive justice collective, says that reproductive justice is the human right to maintain personal bodily autonomy, have children, not have children, and parent the children we have in safe and sustainable communities. I see this as inextricably linked to Mad Liberation because in Mad Liberation, we are 100% advocating for bodily autonomy, for anti-carcerality, for the decision to decide what we do to our bodies, what we put in our bodies, what comes out of our bodies. And thinking about Mad Liberation as starting, in childhood, as starting in the womb, because what is going on with the parent that is gestating us is inevitably the footprint that we come into this life with. So thinking about it from that standpoint as well. Thinking about how do we raise these children in our communities, because so often carceral punishment begins in schools with how we punish children for behaviors, and that language goes into language about mental illness or dysfunction, or just very eugenic language around how little humans exist in the world. So I see reproductive justice and Mad Liberation as really one and the same. And the lens that I've been taking with this is this concept of like reproductive mental health that is looking at the reproductive spectrum from menstruation to menopause. So it's not just about birth and postpartum and abortion, but it's also about when we bleed and what we're going through in that process, what's deemed normal and abnormal, quote unquote. I'm so glad later on there's going to be a panel on menopause and psychosis, because menopause is another one of those reproductive experiences that we don't really talk about when it comes to mental health and Mad Liberation, and ideas of value, of like what bodies are valuable and why. This conversation with reproductive justice also goes into the abolition of the family regulation system, because the eugenic idea of like who is fit to be a parent comes into a lot of our experiences as Mad parents. A lot of us have had experiences with child protective services, with family separation, and that is absolutely something that we need to be centering in this cross movement work, because the fight really, we've heard of school to prison pipeline. It's really womb to prison pipeline, because the interventions and the carceral punishment just comes in so early. So that's what I'd like to say about the intersection of reproductive justice and mad liberation from a Black feminist perspective. I'd also like to call in spirituality, which Stephanie mentioned, also our lineage and the healing our ancestral lines, because of particularly being a descendant of enslaved ancestors, the immediate separation of, children from their parents because we were commodities that were sold, and healing that wound, healing the fact that our bodies were, producing milk for like our masters' children and not our own. These are all reproductive mental health issues, which we as, birthing folk are reckoning with today. And yeah, I've just been bringing in a lot of other tools to understand my own experience with altered states, particularly using astrology and tarot as tools in my own personal work, which we can talk about later, but that's just some of what's coming to mind for me.
Thank you, Nadia. I appreciate you naming ancestors in the space. And I know Stephanie had named ancestors in this space. And I think, for me, when I look at my experience as a psychiatric survivor, as a mad person, as a disabled person, really one of the biggest pieces that I've been thinking about is kind of this continuum of institutions and incarceration. There were 60 Puerto Rican children who were brought into the Carlisle Indian boarding school in Pennsylvania, in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And I also think about the Hiawatha Asylum for Insane Indians, also known as the Canton State Hospital, that had 300 natives in that facility. And for myself, as an Indigenous mixed race person, I really see these experiences as inseparable, because when I was incarcerated in a psychiatric institution, the experience was very much, I was being brought in and labeled non-compliant. I was being, viewed and treated in this way in that space because as a native mixed race Hispanic person. So I think there's an importance there when we talk about our ancestors and that pain, but also that healing, right? And those opportunities for healing, I think, are critical to cross-movement solidarity. So we'll go to Leah in terms of your journey when we talk about your lineages and cross-movement solidarity and some of your work.
Sure. So there's a few things I want to bring up, really. And it's interesting that this idea of being mixed race has come up a couple of times, because that's also how I identify. So my mother was Indonesian and my father was mixed English and Irish. My mom brought me up with stories, oral history of my ancestors, most notably my grandfather, my maternal grandfather, who was a freedom fighter against the Dutch colonization and occupation of Indonesia and my island, where people were enslaved, raped, horrendous violence was committed in the name of white colonialism. But that's juxtaposed with some of my lived experience of being with her. So on one hand, there was this pride that we'd fought against this occupation. On the other side, there was this absolute need to align ourselves with whiteness. So I was born in England, I was born in the UK, and she wanted me to have kind of nothing to do with my Indonesian background. When her sisters came over, she would shut the door so they could speak their language, and I need to speak English. She wanted me to be as white passing as possible to have the best life chances. And I get it, because that's reality for a lot of first and second and even further generation immigrants. We have to assimilate. And that's why Asians have been seen as the model minority, because we are most aligned with whiteness. And this was brought up to me in my own mental health journey, because I had like this two sides of me, this stiff upper lip British person, and then I had this like beating heart, screaming to the sky Asian person, as I'm Indonesian person. which led to this great like schism in me where I had all these feelings and all this rage that I couldn't express. And that brings me to the other point of like movement lineage that I think I had. And I referenced it earlier, like a real shifting point for me was recognizing the anti-violence movement, gender-based violence movement, feminism within what was going on inside me. My mom was a victim of domestic violence. She got into a marriage where, this guy used to beat her, berate her. She was going through chemotherapy treatment at the time, so she was essentially dying of cancer. And he would demand that the will be changed, so it would be in his name and not her children's name. That was what they would regularly fight about, and she would get hurt about. This experience of domestic violence brings up to me again, like parallels within the mental health system and the journey. I spent 6 years working in the anti-violence movement, working for a local YWCA association in Indiana, leading a large-scale domestic violence and sexual violence program. And one of the things I learned there, and we had as part of our framework, was this idea that domestic violence and all types of violence are brought on by unequal power dynamics in society. So there's kind of two ways this comes about. One is through unearned power and someone inflicting that upon other people. So, you think in domestic violence terms, maybe the police chief who beats his wife. Okay, if you think of a stereotype. But on the other hand, violence comes about because people have no power in society and they're desperately trying to get it back. I could see that in my journey. There were times in my life where I was violent because I was experiencing such distress and people were trying to cart me off to hospital. So I had to be restrained and taken against my will. But I also saw it in the psychiatrists who were doing, terrible things for me, not taking account any of my own, as Pat Deegan spoke to earlier, any of my own, my wishes and my hopes and dreams for my future, or taking into account how medication felt for me. So to me, that was systemic violence within the psychiatric system of someone with this unearned power inflicting it upon me. So I'd say those are my two main points of reference, is that anti-violence movement and maybe that anti-colonialism experience.
Thank you for naming that work in anti-violence and anti-colonialism. I think it's so essential right now, and it always has been. I think I'm going to move on to the next question, which I think people have started to name, but I'd like to unpack a little bit more. What are the barriers to cross-movement solidarity within specifically the psychiatric justice movement or movements? And how can we overcome them? What are some ways in which you all think that we can overcome them? I'm going to start with Stephanie.
Barriers to cross-movement solidarity. So many. I'll just name a couple. I think one that is glaringly present is has to do with white people and decentering whiteness and white experiences as a starting point of unlearning the individualized nature of how we've been conditioned to think of our experiences, and moving towards a place where we're even capable of starting to see the interconnections between how what is done to us in the mental health system is similarly connected to what is done to incarcerated people in prisons, to folks who are in nursing facilities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so if we are not making these connections between what happens to the land, what we do to each other, what we do to ourselves, our experiences within systems, then we will have no chance at cross-movement solidarity. Because if we're showing up in a space only to demand that other group serves our purpose, right, and meets our needs, rather than working together in mutual relationship, and also recognizing that there are moments where where, you know, it's not oppression Olympics, but the reality is certain moments call for more attention to be placed in certain directions. So when I was talking about Palestine on a different panel, the response from the facilitator was like, well, there's a lot of people suffering in the world right now, and we should always hold compassion for that. Yes, and there's an active genocide happening that's being live streamed that we're all watching, right? And so there is a way in which we need to be willing to decenter and to recognize that there are moments that call for more urgency towards a community that is calling for action and solidarity and support. And so that's kind of one piece of it. I think there's also been like an unwillingness to confront lateral ableism and lateral oppression, and you know, just mushing together all of these very unique experiences of disability, the same way that disability is not experienced the same depending on how you are racially classed and identify. It's not the same based on your class, based on what disabilities that you have, if they are identified visibly by others, if they're intermittently apparent, if only you know about it. And so we have a lot of ways that we need to sit back and listen, and recognize that liberation might not look like meeting all of our particular goals in a certain moment. And what does that mean? Because that's what real relationships require. They require sacrifice. They require working in coalitions of people who do have different beliefs and language that we use to describe our experiences. But like, what is that end goal, right? And then again, I think another big one that I'll just name is, again, that like co-optation of our movements, and the ways in which we just have slowly depoliticized, and even the like saying like mental health is political can cause like a whole frenzy of, oh no, we don't go in that direction. And so that's why I go back to that 1972 Madness Network news piece where I'm like, they were not afraid to say abolish psychiatry. Like that was clear. And it was clear that we were in solidarity. And now I think movement spaces try to use a lot of like language to like subtly drop that we're in some kind of solidarity with something, but we don't do anything that actually puts ourselves in jeopardy. Our donors might be upset with our organization, so we don't put out a statement of solidarity. And so we really need to get clear about what we're willing to lose in order to gain what we need, which is cross-movement solidarity.
Thank you, Stephanie. And I'm going to go over for the same question to Nadia. Would you like me to repeat the question, or?
Sure, you can repeat the question.
Yeah. What are the barriers to cross-movement solidarity within the psychiatric justice movement, and how can we overcome them?
Yeah, I've been having a lot of conversations recently about abolition, and like realizing that we all don't actually have the same definition of abolition, or not all of us really know what that means. And I'd like to just pick up on what Stephanie said about abolishing psychiatry. Like people get really scared about like, I have a diagnosis. I can't get access my lithium? Like what will happen to this and this and that? And abolishing psychiatry means that like the system that is in charge of this that gets to say to me that you're ill or you need this or you need that, it comes that is abolished, and we have access to whatever it is that we need, but it's controlled by the community. It's democratic, and it's not this top-down enforced hierarchical carceral relationship. So I thought that's really important, because like I have chosen to be on medication to manage being in a physical body where I can't always be channeling my ancestors, who are spirits that don't need to eat or drink or sleep. And when I'm channeling them, you know, my body gets neglected, and I need medication to kind of like be on this 3D plane. And I would love for access to the tools, whatever they are, to take care of myself without the copays, without the diagnostic like number that goes to the insurance company and like all of those other things that are so steeped and rooted in capitalism and exploitation and carcerality and surveillance and all of that. So I hope that clarifies a little bit what this discussion of abolishing psychiatry means and how we can all be in solidarity, whether or not we're on medication, whether or not we have a diagnosis, whether or not we identify with the thing. So that's one. Another thing I find very interesting is this lack of solidarity with people who either have kids or do not have kids or don't want to have kids or whatever that is. Reproduction is not only biological, it's social, and how we take care of each other, how we take care of our kin, of our elders, of our children, of people who are pregnant, people who are postpartum, people who are dying. There's like a wide spectrum. And I think what impedes solidarity within reproductive justice is this thing of like, oh, I don't have a uterus, so what does this have to do with me? It has everything to do with you because somebody, multiple people who have a uterus and bleed and birth, and that is should be of absolute concern to all of us if we are to think communally and think about what it looks like to practice social reproduction. And that should be something that we are all taking on if we are going to achieve solidarity when it comes to mad liberation and reproductive justice. And if we really care about this fight against genocide, and knowing that half of the people in Palestine are children, and the intersection again of reproductive justice and mad liberation, and the fact that most people don't have hygiene products. There are a lot of pregnant people there who have no access to services. There are a lot of orphans. There are just the reproductionists all over this issue, and mental health and madness, rightly so, as a result of the violence that is being experienced, is all over this. So we just need to start opening our eyes to those, connections.
Thank you, Nadia. Yeah, opening our eyes. I think that's an important takeaway here as well. And I'm going to ask Dustin the same question, which is what are the barriers to cross-movement solidarity and how can we overcome them?
Yeah, this is Dustin. I could probably tell you a lot of barriers. I don't know how to overcome a lot of them. I can tell you that. But it's like I don't know, like I'm just like thinking of like examples. Like one time this is like 2018, like we had been in protest for probably like, I don't know, 60, 70 days at that point. And we were protesting like on the ground. We're also organizing. Somebody checked themselves into a psych ward. So I went to visit them to try to get them out after the 72-hour hold. They ended up keeping them. And while that person was like in Western Psych, this is in Pittsburgh, they was talking about the Wi-Fi network that we were attempting to build in this neighborhood called Wilkinsburg. And like the people there was just like, yo, this is like what you're saying is wild. And then what he was saying was like literally a critique of capitalism. And like what we wanted to do was like intervene within that, to provide free Wi-Fi to a neighborhood that doesn't have it. But I think about like a bunch of moments like that where that like required like the quote unquote care team to actually like listen to what the fuck he was saying, and then also to have an understanding of capitalism as well, to know that he is not just like saying some big wild shit. But to me, that is like the connections of a liberatory framework and freedom forever, and how psychiatry has been weaponized to suppress or to manufacture like quote unquote like disabilities in order to like maintain power. So like people really have to lose their jobs, like as far as like the barriers. Like when I'm in a situation as a patient, like I often am, like I'm willing to risk like my freedom and possibly my life just to tell the truth in order to like just be okay that day, right? Now somebody's not willing to risk their job to just be like, all right, like, I'm not gonna turn you into the police. Then that power dynamic is like too great for us to ever be in solidarity. I think another thing is just like I think Steph said this is like, what are people willing to like sacrifice? Like right now, we talking about like, how can we be in like solidarity with different movements? The disabled folks I know, many of them have compounding disabilities. One exacerbates the other. Having them leads to more disabilities. And then that, you know, is interplaying with whatever our conditions are. So in a time like where a pandemic is happening, it's like, fam, how can we be in solidarity if people are not willing to just like have masks, right? Like I can't be where you are at in person without like a mask requirement. I can't be there without PCR testing. These are things that like people within institutions have access to. There's not a PCR test in this city of Baltimore. You got to drive like 30, 40 minutes to get one. And then you got to pay $150, $200 for it. So that is the type of solidarity we need. Like where people are like, yeah, I will mask up for you. I will like help you find a test in order to even like begin to access care. I've been to like 30 doctors this summer. Not a single one is like okay with masking outside of a physical therapist. And that's like wild to me because that is like the type of thing that exacerbates your condition, right? If you're talking about a person like me with whatever psych disabilities I have, like I'm living in an alternate reality where it's like, yo, is the pandemic really happening? Like I'm going to the doctor because I got COVID, because I have long COVID, because I can't breathe. And then I get there and they like, we have no COVID precautions. So it forces you into this like situation where you're constantly like the aggressor, where you're constantly resisting. And we need more people to be resisting. So it's not just like solely on like the quote unquote patient. And the last thing I'll say is just like the reliance on a certain type of knowledge. Like there's no liberatory like knowledge that academia is going to produce wholesale, right? Like I'm not like there's a very like small population of the Walter Rodneys of the world. The majority of academia is not going to produce the knowledge that we need to get free. So we know how academia maintains that power. We know what citations look like. We know what peer journals look like. There needs to be a break from that mold. Like this is like one example of that, of people that are like quote unquote community coming in. But we're also quote unquote community because we have like lived experiences, right? Not that we have lived experience of 15 years organizing with community that has been on the user end of a fucked up system. And that is like the type of knowledge that feels like all of these movements that we talk about. It's never coming from an ivory tower. So I'll pause there.
No, thank you for naming that. I mean, I think people have kind of proceeded as if everything is normal. I mean, like I myself, I have my mask right here, and the reason why I don't wear it is actually in this moment in my body, my resting heart rate is at 110. And I know that I can't speak well and actually wear it, but I wear it throughout the spaces when I walk and I'm here with people. And I think something that's so important when we talk about masking and disability justice is that people can't show up in the spaces. There's so many conferences that have just continued in person, you know? And I think a lot of that has to do with the pace of capitalism and the push to have to do these things and all of these things that we've been naming kind of throughout. I'm gonna ask Leah the same question, you know, we were talking about how we could maybe foster strategies to overcome these barriers. What are some of your thoughts?
Sure. Well, one thing that's really present on my mind as an executive director of a nonprofit, and formerly I was chief program officer at my last position, is the barriers are often the biggest system, right? My first thought to this question was, oh yeah, some of the barriers we face are maybe differences in language that we have between movements, which can cause arguments. And I think Now, what's above that, right? What's above it? So one thing that really comes to my mind is the nonprofit industrial complex, which really hinders our work because, the system isn't going to dismantle itself, right? So it is down usually to nonprofits or grassroots agencies to start doing this work. But yet we're reliant on that capitalist aligned system to fund our work. I think it was Stephanie who mentioned, not wanting to offend your donors, right? And that we need to take a risk, which is true. But then also, what if the risk completely defunds your entire system? Maybe it is a risk worth taking, but these are things that are real and in people's minds, right? I'm thinking to my last position where I was running a domestic violence program, and we had a major donor who came up to me and wanted to talk to me about how, oh, Trump is so right, we need to build that wall. We had eliminating racism, empowering women, above our doorstep. And I just did not know what to say with that man. I very graciously turned my back on him and pretended I didn't hear him and continued on my day. Maybe I should have stood up to him. But that's just one example. If the local community foundation hadn't funded our work, had accused us of mission drift for aligning ourselves to something else, if we were to speak to anti-racism, but we're meant to be about helping those nice families escape the bad man, and we get accused of mission drift when we look across movement. So how can we overcome that? We have to organize against the system that is funding us. We have to say, grant requirements, grant reporting, this all is taking our time. We can't possibly move forward unless the system funds us in a different way, allows us to organize in a different way. So yeah, to me, that's the biggest barrier with social justice work, the system we operate in.
Thank you, Leah. And I think this panel is going to about noon Eastern Standard Time. And what I do want us to kind of come away with is, what does a liberatory future actually look like? And I can say for myself, what a liberatory future looks like is one where people won't even miss these ideas of involuntary commitment or incarcerating people, because they will have everything that they need in the community to sustain what they need for themselves. That we would truly, as the work of Lois Curtis, Black disabled activists, and many others would say, have that right to live in community, desegregated from institutions. When we look at the early, civil rights movement, segregation was a huge part of it, and that did not include disabled folks. So I think there's, for me, it's continuing that mission, and that mission's tied to so many things. It is tied to land back. It is tied to language justice. It is tied to reproductive justice. It is tied to all of these things that we've named. And I think when we look at that liberatory future, it's truly fostering communities of healing that are autonomous, running on their own, right? And again, people having everything that they need in that space. I'm gonna go over to Nadia and kind of go around again. What does a liberatory future look like to you?
Yeah, I'm going to take a little bit of a detour just from what's coming up for me, especially what's happening in the chat. I think a liberatory future for me would be for all of us to actually have a deep understanding of history, a deep education and awareness of why what is happening in the world today, why it is happening the way it is happening. It is not an isolated event. It is not removed from time. The pain that is being experienced is a result of so much history of oppression and colonization and pain from all of our ancestors. What we have endured what oppression we have endured in our ancestral lineages, and the oppression that we perpetuate as a result of the oppression that we have experienced in our lineages. This has to do with white supremacy, has to do with, the wars that are a result of all the xenophobia, religious wars. There is a long history of oppression that we need to reckon with as a collective and within our own personal lineages. And I think a liberatory future would be somewhat attainable if we had access to grief. If we could all really access how we've been harmed, how our ancestors have been harmed, and how in response we are complicit in harm, how our ancestors have been complicit in harm, taking ownership of that, grieving that as a collective. Because until we can really know what happened, we can't have a liberatory future. And cries for liberation and cries for freedom, for land back, those will all be misinterpreted as acts of potential violence that we would commit upon each other, when really, if we grieve together, I think we could actually achieve some level of solidarity, because we have all been in our lineages oppressed, and we have all been oppressors. So I don't know, liberation to me is like a form of death doula work, to really reckon with the horrors of the past, and how do we heal and grieve and create a vision of a future that we all want to live in, and we all understand that we all have equal rights to. So I'm gonna just leave it there.
Thank you, Nadia. I think that's so important to name. We have ancestors of both oppressors and the oppressed. And I think that as we carry that in spaces, we do need to acknowledge that role. Folks have asked me, Vesper, why do you work with the federal government? Why are you in the House of Genocide? Why are you doing all of these things? And usually for me, I answer that I am at it isn't that I don't recognize that the place that I am in has the lineages of destroying my people historically. That pain is very evident in all of the work that I do. It is at the forefront of my mind. And I think when you have that in the space, when you call that in the space, and you're grounded in something really different, you're grounded in liberation for your people, for each other. When you're grounded in that space, it looks different. So I want to also just kind of open it, like if Dustin or Stephanie or Leah, before we take questions, would like to respond to what a liberatory future can look like.
Yep, this is Dustin. I'll just go quickly. One, I wanted to say I appreciated Leah for lifting up violence is something that's necessary to engage with. And in a liberatory future, I think that one, it's an abolitionist future. And I say that in the realm of psychiatry specifically, because that is the ceiling. Once violence becomes a part of it, then the carceral approach, well, I mean, psychiatry in itself is carceral, but then it is into another system of carcerality. So until we're able to actually truthfully engage with violence and that not be just the mandatory, now it's moving to this different system, I don't think we're actually able to respond to each other and get care and get healing and get any type of reparative work done. I think what a liberatory future looks like is what Palestinians are fighting for, honestly. They have demanded what liberation looks like, and that's the right to self-determine. That's not something that is like unique to Palestinians. That's something that people in Haiti right now are fighting for. That is something that across the global South, people have fought for decades and centuries. And the right to self-determine is like very central and core to how I've understood what it means to be disabled and to be a part of a broader disability communities that are fighting for some type of freedom or liberation. That is central to the efforts. Whether it became whitewashed, whether it became something that was reduced to legislation, whether it became something that was a more liberatory framework like disability justice, at the core of all of the struggles has been self-determination. How I learned independent living was like, we're the experts of our own lives. And that's the reason we wanted consumer directed care. That's the reason we wanted the ability to live outside of institutions. That's the reason that we wanted guardianship to be abolished. That's the reason that we wanted special education to be abolished and our needs actually met in a mainstream course. So self-determination is what the Palestinians are fighting for.
I think Dustin froze. I'm going to just pause for a moment. All right, Dustin, it looks like you're back if you want to finish your thought.
Sorry, I might have cut out, but the last thing I'll say is like, there's a Dr. Joseph Guyano, who was a Liberian academic, who just passed a couple of years ago. He said traditionally the in Liberia belongs to the people that are already dead.
Sorry, Dustin, it looks like we lost you again. We'll have to circle back. I want to just make sure
The idea that capitalism, all of the other things are abolished too. All right, I feel like I'm freezing up, so I'm gonna pause.
We got that last bit. It was good. It was good. Thank you.
Can I jump in, Vesper?
Yes.
Yeah, I just want to quickly, building off Nadia and Dustin, I think that a liberatory future requires a morally grounded present, and we need that. And it's very easy to look back and say, oh, that was bad, right? And we see that specifically within one example, the psychiatric survivor movement. In retrospect, everyone was against these horrible asylums, right? That they were so horrific, but people were perpetuating it at the time. And it's still being perpetuated in so many ways, right? The asylum itself never died. So thinking about how we need to maintain a very strong sense of our moral guidance here, because when we're, again, talking about Palestine and when we're hearing arguments of it's not really happening, it's complicated, there are two sides. For me, I think about how all of those things have been used against me as a person who's experienced violence in the mental health system. The violence wasn't really happening. Oh, it's complicated. It was for your treatment. It was for your benefit. There are two sides. We're talking about power here. We're talking about power. And all violence is not the same. The violence of taking a person who's experiencing altered states and hearing voices and taking them off the streets and injecting them with a medication that they don't consent to and putting them in a psychiatric unit and putting them in solitary confinement is not the same as that person resisting restraints and maybe hitting someone in the process or being violent or trying to bite or whatever it is to defend, right, your bodily autonomy. So we actually do need to have a critical lens that all violence is not the same. We have to understand context and history. And the same way that so many of us here have an intimate understanding of why we can't trust the mental health system, I would ask you to extend that lens to what we are talking about today. Because if you are asking yourself, oh, I'm not sure what all of this has to do with each other, that's a privilege to not have to live in a world where you are every day navigating the impacts on your mental health, altered experience, the psychosis that might develop due to the brutal oppression that you live through. So the same way that we have this ability to criticize the mental health system because we've been harmed by it is the grounding that needs to be fertilized for our liberatory future.
Thank you. Thank you. And I want to move us to questions because we have till about noon and we're at 11:58. So I'm going to start with maybe a question or two in the room. Well, actually, let's start online. Let's start online with a question or two online because it seems like there's some rich discussion happening in there. I want to acknowledge that. And then we will go in person. We're just waiting for Alex to get the mic here.
So there's a question in the chat, wondering what everyone's thoughts are about how economic systems of power and the resulting inequity that continues to get worse between groups of people, where the top 3 wealthiest white men in the world own more than those 50% of human beings, 3.5 billion people with the least resources, intersect with our other movements for justice.
Would anyone like to answer?
I mean, I would just say they intersect with all of them. Because if we're talking about financial resources and that's what capitalism is, that's the currency of capitalism, then yes, it impacts everything.
Yeah, this is Dustin. I'll just add to that. Capitalism is not something that only exploits us, our labor. It exploits the land. It causes climate catastrophe. It exacerbates health conditions. It is capitalism is what you're describing. It necessitates a poor class of people that are relying upon like corporate, like our needs are commodified under capitalism as well. And it's never a sustainable practice, especially for most of us.
Thank you. Leah, Stephanie?
I had to share my mic. I think the one thing we really need to remember and name is that capitalism sees people who are less economically productive as lesser and inhuman. So, the whole theme of this conference is recognizing humanity, our shared humanity, and being in solidarity with each other. And that's no longer defining people by their financial worth.
I appreciate that piece, the idea that our value is inherent, right? Not contingent on what we produce and what we do. Would we like to go to another question? We are at time technically, but I'd like to do one more. We'll take another one online.
We have a question for Nadia from Eden Alexander. I've worked with women with mental health concerns and substance use disorders who have had children removed from them, as well as a woman with developmental disabilities who was sterilized after multiple rapes. She clearly wanted children. What would it look like for these type of women to be able to get the support to be able to raise children in a safe way where parent and child can thrive?
Thank you for this question. I would say that this applies to all birthing people. The way that this country is structured, and even the US, number one, health insurance. Not all of us being able to afford to pay for prenatal visits, for the birth, the care we need postpartum. I think the standard is 6 weeks of postpartum leave, which is absolutely unacceptable. That needs to be extended with pay. My research specifically looks at maternal mortality in this country, and suicide and overdose are actually the leading causes of maternal death in the United States, with most deaths occurring within the first year postpartum. So there needs to be a lot of support, financial support, housing, safe spaces for birthing people experiencing domestic violence. There are things that I think as a society, if we cared about birthing people and children, there would be this web of support that I think would take care of any birthing person, regardless of what their disabilities are, regardless of what their mental health needs are. And it requires community care and community support. This idea of like it takes a village is very true. And unfortunately, the people who have villages right now are able to pay for them. They're able to pay for help in the house, help with childcare, with school, with whatever medical needs that they have. So I think as a country, we need to actually look at our maternity care system, our parental leave policies, the pay. I mean, like most pay, you can't even afford minimum wage if you have a child at home. You can't even afford the childcare because that's your whole entire salary out the window. So yes, we see the effects more exacerbated for parents who have mental health needs or are disabled, but this is actually a crisis across the board for all birthing people and families that we need to be addressing.
Thank you for naming that. And with that, we're going to close out our panel, but I want to take a moment to celebrate our panelists and say thank you for everything you brought to this space.